Welcome. This lecture is on the insurrections of 1837-1838. An insurrection is an armed rebellion against a government. In 1837 and 1838, Lower and Upper Canada witnessed radical politicians opt for violence against two colonial governments. Frustrated Canadians had reason to protest government policies that favored the friends of government, but only a small number in both Lower and Upper Canada believed the problems were serious enough to risk their lives in armed conflict. Canadian insurrectionists died in battle and or later for treason for reforms that were coming around the corner without the necessity of violence. The loss of lives was tragic and pointless. Farmers, the largest group in Lower Canada, encountered significant challenges, mostly due to the sharp rise in population in the early 1800s. Many of the seigneuries had filled up, and families continued to slice up their strips of land for their sons. Much of the new land cleared for cultivation was poor, rocky soil. After the War of 1812, farmers experienced many poor harvests because of bad weather, disease, and insects. In some years, entire harvests were lost. The reaction of many French Canadian farmers to such hard times was frustration and anger. In addition to the possibility of food shortages, they were apprehensive of the large number of non-French immigrants who arrived in Lower Canada. They saw English immigrants as a threat to their French farms, language, and way of life. It was a relief for many that most of the English immigrants pushed on to Upper Canada. There was also concern about the impact of immigration on public health. During the cholera epidemics of 1832, the arrival of six sick immigrants, many from Ireland, caused panic. In that year, approximately 7,500 people died of cholera in Lower Canada. Although the French in Lower Canada greatly outnumbered the English, it was the English who had political and economic control. The Constitutional Act of 1791 had separated the English of Lower Canada from the Americans and British who were settling in Upper Canada, but English-speaking merchants in Quebec and Montreal remained dominant. In 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote, quote, "The rich classes belong for the most part to the English race. Although French is the language spoken by most people, the majority of the newspapers and even the signs of the French shopkeepers are in English. Business is almost in the hands of the English. They are really the leading class in Canada." This state of affairs was unacceptable to French Canadian professionals who began to push their agenda. Educated French Canadian males, many doctors or lawyers, were critical of commerce capitalism and the influence of the church, which was too supportive of Britain. Politics became an outlet for their ambitions. The professionals hinted of rebellion. They gained control of the assembly, the only part of the government elected by the people. They established the first French Canadian newspapers and formed the Parti Canadien, a political party that initially remained loyal to British parliamentary institutions, but later favored republicanism. The emerging political conflict was between English elites who controlled the executive and French Canadian professionals who controlled the assembly. The first stormy period was when Sir James Henry Craig was governor. Craig was unreasonably authoritarian, and his opponents hyperbolically called his time the Reign of Terror. From 1807 to 1811, Craig orchestrated the dismissal of the assembly, the shutting down of the French press, and the jailing of editors. Seeking popular support, the French professionals tied their agenda to the interests of dissatisfied French farmers who played a lesser role in the economy and in government. Another interesting component was the several important English-speaking reformers who sided with the French against the government. One patriot was Wilfred Nelson, an English doctor. Certainly, English Catholics settling in Lower Canada had little love for what they saw as British oppression. Under the leadership of Louis Joseph Papineau, a lawyer, the Lower Canadian Assembly attempted to take control of all public revenues. By the early 1830s, French Canadians representing the Patriots Party, formerly the Parti Canadien, wanted an elected legislative council along American lines. In 1834, the Lower Canadian Assembly produced a radical document called the 92 Resolutions of Grievances. Number 37 is revealing. Quote, resolved that the political world in Europe is at this moment agitated by two great parties who in different countries appear under the several names of the Serviles, Royalists, Tories, and Conservatives on the one hand, on the one side, and of Liberals, Constitutionalists, Republicans, Whigs, Reformers, Radicals, and similar appellations on the other, that the former is, on this continent, without any weight or influence except what it derives from its European supporters and from a trifling number of persons who become their dependents for the sake of personal gain, and of others who from age or habit cling to opinions which are not partaken by any numerous class, while the second party overspreads all America. However, French and English moderates who equally wanted change to the parliamentary system were unwilling to support the extremism of the radicals. Papineau and other political radicals found no support from the Roman Catholic clergy who pointed to the radicals' anti-clerical statements and threats of violence. In 1837, the British Parliament rejected the 92 resolutions and issued its 10 resolutions declaring the colonies were not ready for self-government. The British government also permitted the government in Lower Canada to use local revenues without the Assembly's authority. The radicals responded with open rebellion in November 1837. They approved a Declaration of Independence. At Saint Denis, the Patriots repelled a detachment of British troops who attempted to arrest Papineau before he fled to the United States. 2 days later, French troops killed over 100 rebels at Saint Charles and 70 rebels in a battle at Saint Eustache. The rebellion was a resounding failure. In 6 battles, approximately 300 rebels died. Only in Montreal region was there significant support for the radicals, and the flight of Papineau left the movement without a leader in the face of well-trained British troops. Most important was the opposition of the Roman Catholic Church. There were French farmers who were supportive of reforms that promised improvements for their livelihood, but long held respect for the authority of the church and doubts about Papineau's American and anti-religious position thwarted mass support. The experience in Upper Canada differed from Lower Canada in several ways. The heritage of loyalism and the conservatism of Upper Canadian society gave the government widespread public support. Party lines were not as clear-cut as in Lower Canada. Politics were more of an individualistic nature, and thus many members of the Assembly supported the government on some issues and opposed it on others. And of course, Upper Canadian society did not have to confront issues of language and race, as was the case in Lower Canada. In Upper Canada, the ruling elite shared the same language and ancestry with most of the people. Signs of discontent in Upper Canada did not become pronounced until after the War of 1812. With the end of wartime demand for supplies, prices and trade declined until immigration from elsewhere stimulated the economy. Population was still modest compared to American states along the eastern seaboard. The first challenge to the Upper Canadian government was from Robert Goulet, a recent immigrant from Scotland. In 1817, he published two manifestos criticizing the government, and he organized meetings throughout Upper Canada. The government reacted by passing a law prohibiting such meetings, charged Gourlay with sedition, and threw him in jail for 6 months before banishing him from Upper Canada in 1819. Grievances of the post-war period began to lose their urgency as economic conditions improved. The reform movement fizzled for several years. Church-state questions and land property issues produced more conflict. On the issue of land and property, the government was slow to allow American-born settlers the right to hold public office and to own property. It was not until 1827 that the British government ordered the passing of a bill confirming property rights for anyone who had been a resident in Upper Canada for more than 7 years. The question concerning church and state relations was more vexing. Those who were in power were members of the Family Compact, a tightly knit elite group linked to the Church of England. Most of the population was not Anglican, and consequently, the close relationship between the government and the Anglican Church was unpopular. Disliked for his Tory and high church views, Bishop John Strong had become a member of both the legislative and the executive councils. He was everything that the respectable classes admired, but he was hated by opponents. Divisive was the issue of the clergy reserve, which consisted of 1/7 of the land in each township. The Anglicans sought sole control of this land. Most Methodists and nearly all other Protestants opposed government financial aid to any one church. These Protestants advocated voluntary support of churches and argued that the funds from the clergy reserve should be used to provide public education for all citizens. Some saw the clergy reserves as barriers to settlement. The issue of the clergy reserves added fuel to the grievances of settlers trying to get land for farms, the privileges of the Church of England, and the power of the Family Compact. Popular resentment against Anglican dominance in education increased. Bishop Strong supported public education, but on his terms. The textbooks had a strong Church of England bias. At Strong's urging, in 1827, the British government granted a charter for King's College. The plan was that professors would be Anglican and Strong president. Due to a strong public outcry, the university did not open until the 1840s without Strong's plan. Methodist preacher Egerton Ryerson did heroic work to oppose the high-handedness of family compact elites. There were other frustrations with the government, notably how crown or public lands went to wealthy speculators more often than to actual farmers. Friends of the family compact held vast areas of empty land, keeping the prices up and blocking regular and easy settlement. There was some opposition to government funding for projects such as the Welland Canal. The farmers, often in debt, mistrusted banks. Moreover, farmers complained about the slow construction of roads. By 1824, a reform party began to take shape. It was supported by people such as William Lyon Mackenzie, a radical from Scotland who started the Colonial Advocate, a newspaper that exposed abuses by the government. When a mob of Tories broke into his newspaper shop and threw his presses into Toronto Bay, Mackenzie's stature among reformers increased. The attack by the young sons of the family compact backfired, and the courts awarded Mackenzie enough money to resume publishing his paper. By 1828, he was in the assembly that had a reform majority. Election campaigns of this era were occasions for parades, loud speeches, and brawls. There was no secret ballots, and voters shouted their choices out loud for everyone to hear, while the two sides traded insults, threw stones, and swung clubs at each other. The reformers saw themselves as part of the greater progressive movement that was being played out in other countries. For example, Britain had its Great Reform Bill. However, progress was too slow for Mackenzie. The government expelled him 4 times from the assembly. After visiting the United States and meeting President Andrew Jackson, Mackenzie's views became too extreme in the eyes of moderate reformers. The leader of the moderate wing of the reformers was Robert Baldwin, who wanted to preserve Upper Canada's allegiance to the British Crown. In 1836, reformers squared off with Sir Francis Bond Head, the new governor. After some political jabs from each side, the legislature dissolved. The governor called an election and campaigned that voters had to decide if they wanted American republicanism or continued connection to the British Crown. The reformers lost this political showdown. Tory bribery was greater than reform bribery, and strategic selection of polling favored the Tories, who benefited from the rapid enfranchisement of many new British immigrants, such as Irish Protestants. Most Upper Canadian residents were suspicious of the radical democratic experiment south of the border. American democracy had yet to solve the calamity of slavery. At this point, many Upper Canadian Methodists did not have a strong American connection, and there was less conflict between Methodists and Anglicans. The possibility of sharing clergy reserves, plus the right to solemnize marriages, had eased tensions between Anglicans and other Protestants. After Mackenzie and most other reformers lost the election of 1836, he decided that Canada must cut its ties with the British government. He went about the countryside, stirring up the people to overthrow the government. He hurled insults at his enemies as supporters shouted and waved homemade flags that read "Liberty or Death." When Mackenzie heard that Lower Canada was in arms, with troops from Upper Canada being sent there, he began his insurrection. However, Mackenzie was not a military leader. and the rebel force was a farce. In early December 1837, Mackenzie and a ragtag army of approximately 500 men, armed with pitchforks and clubs with few guns, traveled down Yonge Street to Toronto. Mackenzie expected the opposition would retreat, but when a small group of defenders fired on the rebel group, the reformers, except two who died, bolted from the scene. All rebels fled when additional troops descended on Toronto. Mackenzie retreated to the United States. Another insurrection force led by Dr. Charles Duncombe also failed in Western Upper Canada. In the United States, Mackenzie raised support for further insurrection, and there were raids along the border in 1838. He and his supporters occupied an island just above the Niagara Falls. They left the island after an Upper Canada militia destroyed the Caroline, an American ship used to transport supplies to the island. Further to the west, there were raids along the Detroit River, including a serious engagement in which 30 rebels were killed. The last serious raid occurred on the St. Lawrence near Prescott in November of 1838. The United States government did not favor these raids, and consequently, they did not occur beyond 1838. The rebellion was lost. Indeed, it had been hopeless from beginning to end. Only the radical wing of the reformers had approved of it. Most reformers made clear they had no desire to take part in violence or to break ties with the British in seeking change. There was anger and protest against government measures that favored elites, but only a small number of people chose to settle their grievances with weapons and violence. Partisan and authoritarian governors in the Canadas were infuriating, but so too were the rabble-rousing politicians such as Papineau in Lower Canada and Mackenzie in Upper Canada, who adopted hyperbolic language and acts of armed rebellion. Their treasonous plans were out of proportion to the difficulty that most people faced. Many farmers led uncomplicated lives. There was no government coercion of any substance or overburdensome taxation to compel them to take action beyond grumbling about their grievances. Certainly, the goal of independence by insurrection made no moral, economic, or political sense. Thank you.